North Korea appears to have launched another round of short-range missiles today. South Korea says the North fired the missiles into the Sea of Japan twice. Now, if you're keeping count, yes, this is the country's third weapons test in just over a week.
Analysts say North Korea is frustrated with planned joint U.S.-South Korea military drills. Debora Patta is following the escalating tensions from Hong Kong.
The third round of North Korean missiles was fired from what appears to be a new launch site, according to South Korea. The short-range missiles traveled about 136 miles and were unusually fast, say analysts. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been flexing his muscles ahead of a planned military drill by the U.S. and South Korea. The two allies have not held any major military operations since President Trump met Kim Jong-un last year. Since then, negotiations to denuclearize North Korea have stalled despite attempts to jumpstart those talks at a recent meeting in the demilitarized zone as recently as June 30th. The chief U.S. envoy to North Korea met with his counterparts in Bangkok to discuss resuming those talks. And meanwhile, President Trump has shrugged off the flurry of missiles, saying he has no problem with them as they are not part of his agreement with Kim Jong-un, which only prohibits the firing of long-range missiles. Vlad, Adriana?
All right, Deborah, thank you very much. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News White House correspondent Ben Tracy. Of course, he was recently based in Beijing, as were you, Adriana. You were
right.
our correspondent at one point in Asia. So, Ben, let's begin here. Why doesn't President Trump appear to be at all concerned about North Korea's series of missile tests?
Well, it really is pretty striking. We've come a long way from fire and fury. The president was asked on the lawn here yesterday what he thinks of this kind of unusually busy week of missile launches by North Korea. And his bottom line was that he's not bothered by it. And he says he's not bothered by it because he never made a deal with Kim Jong-un about short-range missiles. He says that his deal with Kim Jong-un is that Kim Jong-un will put a moratorium on long-range ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons testing. Now, that misses a very important point, that these missiles may be short-range, meaning they can't hit the U.S., but they certainly can hit Japan and they can hit South Korea. In South Korea, we have nearly 30,000 American troops. In Japan, we have 50,000.
So, Ben, let me just follow up on that. I'm glad you raised that point, because whether it's a long-range missile or a short-range missile, why is North Korea firing any missiles at all? And they are doing it, as both of you will know, they're trying to show the world something. They're trying to show South Korea something. They're trying to show Japan something. And it just seems strange that the president isn't bothered by it at all.
And these aren't just run-of-the-mill missile tests. What we've been told, the intelligence shows, is that they have tested a new missile launching system. So they are building capacity here by doing this. Now, you could say they're doing this to draw attention to themselves, to say, let's get back on track with these negotiations. Or this could be what they often do ahead of the military drills that will take place in South Korea, where they make a show of force as kind of a face-saving gesture, or to say, hey, we really hate these military drills you do, and remember, we have all these weapons.
That's such a good point. I mean, every test brings technological advances and brings them closer to a potential long-range missile. But turning to China, as you saw, these tariffs are creating so much buzz in Beijing. Beijing already today vowed to retaliate against President Trump's planned tariff hike on Chinese goods. What do you think the impact will be, and where will it be most seen in the U.S.?
It's likely consumers will actually notice this time. This is a 10% tariff on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods. And when you add in the other tariffs that already exist, this means that basically everything that China sends to the U.S. now has a tax on it. The difference here is that we're no longer talking about just like washing machine parts. This is going to be tennis shoes and T-shirts and iPhones and iPads. This is stuff people go and buy at Walmart and at Target. So this is either a tax that American companies will just eat, or it's something more likely that they will pass on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
And it's interesting, Ben, yesterday at the White House, the president said that China will pay for these tariffs. But we've spoken to so many businesses every time that there are these tariff threats, and they all say that the price increase will be passed on to consumers. We actually did a story interviewing a fireworks retailer who imports from China, and he said that if tariffs are raised by 10%, for example, he has to raise prices by more than 10% because now his costs are going up. So he has to borrow money. Borrowing money is not free, so that's something to keep in mind. So, Ben, in your view, do you think that trade talks are essentially over?
Well, they're not over. They are saying here at the White House that more trade talks are scheduled for September here in Washington, but it's hard to ignore the fact that they're just not making any progress in these talks. The president says that China reneged on the deal that they were very close to reaching a couple of months ago, and it sounds like they're kind of back to square one in terms of trying to get China on board with these big structural issues of, intellectual property theft and kind of how American companies are treated in China. So these are big problems. And President Trump seems now to be making an argument that he thinks China is dragging its feet, hoping that he loses the upcoming election, and that they will have a Democrat in the White House. And in President Trump's view, that would be an easier negotiation for China.
All right, Ben, let me ask you about something else. The United States withdrawing from a Cold War-era nuclear treaty with Russia. Secretary Pompeo tweeted about this earlier, saying Russia has repeatedly violated the agreement. What exactly is this treaty? Remind our viewers, and why is it important?
So this is the INF Treaty. This is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This was something that was signed by President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev back in the 1980s. This is a treaty that basically limited a certain class of nuclear weapons. There was about 2,600 missiles destroyed because of this treaty. But what has happened is the United States has said that Russia has repeatedly violated this treaty, that they are not playing by the rules. And if they're not going to follow it, then the U.S. should not be bound by it either. The fear here, of course, is that this could spark a new nuclear arms race, especially now that you have China in the mix. You think back to the 1980s, a very different world when we were basically just talking about the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now you have China building weapons, and it's a very different dynamic.
And we're keeping you busy here this morning with so much news out of the White House, of course. The president's rally yesterday in Ohio made big news. He continued to slam Democrats. He criticized major U.S. cities again, like Baltimore and Los Angeles. Is this part of his reelection strategy? Is that what people are saying in D.C.? And do you think it's working? Or do people think it's working with voters?
Well, at a Make America Great Again rally, basically everything the president says works. They are there to see him. They are there for the show, and they really like what he comes and says. It was an odd thing last night, though, to hear him kind of go on this extended riff on American cities. It was basically a reprise of his inauguration speech of American Carnage. He didn't just talk about Baltimore, which has been on his mind, obviously, in the last week or so. He talked about San Francisco. He talked in very stark terms about Los Angeles. He spent a lot more time on that than calling Democrats socialists, which we are told is the real campaign strategy here. It's basically to say that all the Democrats are the same, they're all socialists, and he's trying to reach those middle-of-the-road voters who may not like President Trump, but they may dislike the idea of socialism a whole lot more.
Yeah, the president is the president of all of the United States of America. He is the president of those citizens who are living in some cases in difficult conditions, whether they be in Baltimore or Chicago or in cities affected by the opioid crisis in Kentucky and West Virginia. And so that's why, as you say, Ben, it's surprising to hear the president going after an American city as if it's not part of this country.
Well, and keep in mind, the president has also been very critical of lawmakers who have said anything at all critical of the country, of his policies. It was just a couple of weeks ago he was having this fight with the so-called squad in Congress. But then the president stood up there at a podium and he went on and on about some of these American cities being horrible, horrible places to live.
All right, Ben Tracy for us at the White House. Ben, as always, we thank you.
Thanks.